What if the people laughing at your dreams aren't laughing because your dreams are foolish, but because your dreams remind them of everything they gave up? Most people believe that when someone mocks their ambition, it's harmless. A joke, a little teasing between friends, something to shrug off. But few people realize that mockery is rarely about you. It is almost never about your idea, your business, your workout plan, your degree, or your 5-year vision. It is about the mirror you've accidentally placed in front of someone who has stopped growing. The disturbing truth is this: the moment you start moving toward a better version of yourself, you become a walking accusation to everyone who chose comfort over growth. And comfort, when confronted with ambition, does not stay silent. It defends itself. It mocks. It minimizes. It laughs first so it doesn't have to feel envy later. Friedrich Nietzsche wrote that a man's growth is measured by how much truth he can tolerate, or more precisely, how much truth he needs to dilute, disguise, and screen off. Applied here, the people who mock your ambition are often the ones who cannot tolerate the truth your ambition represents. Your effort is a mirror, and some people would rather shatter the mirror than face what it shows them. In this video, we'll uncover the 7 hidden psychological signs behind people who mock ambition, why this behavior is more dangerous than open enemies, and exactly how a psychologically strong person responds when they encounter it. By the end, you will never see a joke about your goals the same way again. There's a particular kind of friend who, the moment you share a goal, responds with a slow shake of the head and the words, "Just be realistic." On the surface, this looks like concern. It sounds like wisdom. Most people misread it as protection, a friend trying to shield you from disappointment. But here is the hidden psychological meaning most people never see. Telling someone to be realistic is often not a statement about your potential. It is a statement about their own surrender. Somewhere along the way, this person wanted something bigger for themselves. And somewhere along the way, they stopped believing it was possible. Now, your ambition threatens the peace they made with giving up. Carl Jung called this the shadow, the parts of ourselves we refuse to look at directly. So instead, we project them outward. A person who has buried their own ambition under years of excuses does not want to sit with that grief. It is far easier to redirect that discomfort onto you, dressed up as advice, than to admit, "I wish I had tried harder." Think about the friend who never left their hometown, watching you pack your bags for a new city and a new opportunity. Think about the coworker who stopped applying for promotions years ago, smiling thinly when you mention you're studying for a certification after work. Think about the family member who calls your business idea a phase, while quietly avoiding any mention of their own unfinished dreams. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself daily that other people's opinions of his path were not obligations he needed to carry. "You have power over your mind, not outside events," he wrote. "The realist who discourages you is not handing you truth. They are handing you their own limitation, wrapped as caution." The insight to remember: realism is rarely about facts. It is almost always about fear wearing a disguise. Pay close attention to timing. When you share something you're proud of, a new goal, a new habit, a new direction, and the laugh comes instantly, before any real thought, that speed is data. Most people assume laughter means something is genuinely funny, but quick, reflexive laughter aimed at your ambition is rarely amusement. It is a nervous system reaction. It is discomfort escaping through the fastest exit available. Here is the deeper psychological truth. Genuine humor requires a small delay, a beat where the brain processes incongruity before finding it funny. But defensive laughter is immediate because its purpose isn't comedy. Its purpose is to shrink the threat. If your goal can be laughed at, it can be dismissed. If it can be dismissed, the listener doesn't have to reckon with why they never pursued something similar. Schopenhauer, long before modern psychology had language for ego defense, observed that vanity is one of the most persistent forces in human behavior, and that people will go to great lengths to protect a favorable self-image, even at the cost of honesty. Laughing at your ambition is one of the cheapest ways to protect that self-image. It costs nothing, requires no vulnerability, and instantly repositions the mocker as the amused, superior observer, rather than the person quietly falling behind. Picture this. You tell your sibling you're starting to invest, and they laugh. "Oh, so you're a Wall Street guy now?" You tell an old classmate you're training for a marathon, and they smirk. "Since when do you run?" You mention wanting to write a book, and someone chuckles. Everyone thinks they have a book in them. None of these reactions are really about you. They are about a gap. The gap between who that person is and who they once imagined they'd become. Your ambition simply made that gap visible for a second, and laughter was the fastest way to close it back up. The insight to remember: the speed of mockery reveals more than its content ever will. This one is subtler and far more damaging because it hides behind the language of loyalty. This is the friend who says, "I just don't want you to get hurt," right before listing every possible way your plan could fail. The friend who responds to your excitement with a list of risks nobody asked for. The friend who frames discouragement as devotion. Most people misread this as genuine care because it's delivered gently, sometimes even with tears in their eyes. But notice the pattern. Their concern only appears when you're moving forward, never when you're standing still. If protection were their true motive, they'd be equally worried about you wasting your life in stagnation. They're not. Their alarm is selective, and selective concern is not concern. It's control. Jung's concept of the shadow applies again here, but in a more insidious form. This person may genuinely believe they are protecting you. That's what makes it dangerous. Their unconscious fear of being left behind disguises itself as love, and because it feels sincere, you're less likely to question it. Think of the parent who discourages a child's unconventional career, not out of malice, but out of unspoken fear that their child's success will highlight the risks they themselves were too afraid to take. Think of the partner who quietly undermines your side business, worried, deep down, that your growth might outpace theirs and eventually leave them behind. Think of the best friend who says, "Don't get your hopes up," every single time, until you realize their hope died years ago, and they've been living inside that grief ever since. Nietzsche wrote about the danger of pity as a disguised form of superiority. Pity that keeps the sufferer small so the pitier can remain comfortable in their own position. The friend who constantly finds the flaw in your plan may not want you to fail out of cruelty. They may want you to fail so the emotional order between you both stays unchanged. The insight to remember: not everyone who says, "I'm worried about you," is protecting you. Some are protecting the version of themselves that needs you to stay where you are. There is a particular silence that speaks louder than any insult. The silence that follows good news. You get the promotion. You finish the certification. You launch the project. And instead of celebration, you're met with a flat, cool, a changed subject, a conversation that quietly dies. Most people brush this off, assuming the other person is simply busy, distracted, uninterested in details. But withdrawal after your success is rarely about disinterest. It's about an emotional recalibration happening in real time. Your win forces a silent comparison, and comparison, for a fragile ego, is unbearable. This is where social comparison theory becomes essential to understand. Human beings evaluate their own worth largely by measuring themselves against others, especially people close to them. A stranger's success barely registers, but a friend's success a sibling's success, a peer's success. That lands differently because it's measured against a life that feels comparable to your own. When someone you know moves forward and you haven't, the silence isn't apathy. It's the sound of someone quietly recalculating their own position. Stoicism offers a striking contrast here. Marcus Aurelius, one of the most powerful men in the ancient world, wrote constantly about guarding against envy and comparison, precisely because he understood how natural and how corrosive it is. The Stoics didn't pretend envy doesn't exist. They trained against it daily because they knew how easily it hides inside ordinary people, dressed as indifference. Consider the friend group that goes quiet in the chat after you post about your new job. Consider the relative who used to check in weekly, now strangely absent since your business started gaining traction. Consider the old friend who used to be your biggest cheerleader, now oddly cold since you started taking your health seriously and losing weight. The insight to remember: silence after your success is rarely empty. It is often full of everything the other person doesn't want to say out loud. This one cuts deep because it uses real ammunition, your own history. Remember when you tried that before and it didn't work? You said the same thing last year. Didn't you already quit something like this once? Most people interpret this as brutal honesty, someone simply keeping you grounded with facts. But listen carefully to when these reminders surface. They rarely appear when you're struggling. They appear precisely when you're hopeful, precisely when your energy is highest, precisely when you're most likely to succeed. That timing is not coincidence. It's sabotage disguised as memory. Here is the psychological mechanism at work. Human beings build an internal model of who the people around them are, and that model resists updating, because updating it is uncomfortable. If your friend has known you as the person who starts things and doesn't finish them, your growth threatens that internal story. Bringing up your past failure is an unconscious attempt to freeze you in the old version of yourself, because the old version was easier to relate to, easier to feel equal to, and in some cases, easier to feel superior to. Nietzsche's concept of eternal recurrence carries an important lesson here. The idea that your past does not have to be your prison, but rather material you can affirm, transform, and rise above. The people who trap you in your past failures are, often unknowingly, refusing to let you evolve, because your evolution requires them to release an outdated picture of you. And most people are cognitively lazy about updating their beliefs, especially about others. Picture the sibling who reminds you of the business that failed 5 years ago, right as you're launching a new one with far more experience behind it. Picture the ex-partner who brings up your old insecurities right when you start dating with new confidence. Picture the friend who says, "You always say you'll go to the gym," the exact week you've committed to actually going. The insight to remember: people who highlight your past failures are often not protecting you from repeating them. They are protecting themselves from having to see you differently. This sign is quiet, slow, and easy to miss until it's already happened. You start improving your habits, your mindset, your goals, and slowly the invitations stop. The group chat feels different. The jokes don't land the way they used to. You're not explicitly pushed out. You just drift, or seem to. Most people assume this is simply growing apart, a natural consequence of busy adult life. Sometimes that's true, but often something else is happening beneath the surface. Your growth has disrupted the emotional equilibrium of the group, and groups, like individuals, resist change. Every friend group, family system, and social circle develops an unspoken emotional contract, a shared understanding of roles, habits, and pace. When one person begins changing that pace, whether by waking up earlier, drinking less, working harder, or simply talking about a future the others haven't imagined for themselves, It creates what psychologists call cognitive dissonance within the group. Your transformation implies a question none of them asked to be asked. Why haven't I changed too? Rather than sit with that discomfort, groups often resolve it by quietly distancing themselves from the person who caused it. Not out of hatred, out of self-preservation. It is easier to lose one friend than to confront an entire group's stagnation. The Stoics understood something crucial here. You do not owe your growth an apology, and you do not owe stagnant company your loyalty. Epictetus, once enslaved and later one of history's great philosophers, insisted that freedom begins with releasing your need for approval from people who benefit from your limitation. Think of the friend group that used to go out every weekend, growing distant once you start prioritizing sleep and discipline. Think of the family gatherings that feel colder once you stop drinking and everyone else hasn't. Think of the coworkers who stop inviting you to complaint-fueled lunch breaks once you start talking about your side hustle instead of your grievances. The insight to remember. Sometimes you're not being excluded because you changed for the worse. You're being excluded because you changed at all, and change is often unwelcome in rooms built for staying the same. This is perhaps the most sophisticated form of mockery because it wears the mask of wisdom. Don't get too ahead of yourself. Stay humble. Success changes people. Be careful. These phrases sound wise. They sound like something a mentor might say. And sometimes they genuinely are wisdom, offered with love. But there is a version of this that is not wisdom at all. It is control, dressed in humility's clothing. The difference lies in timing and tone. Genuine humility-based advice tends to come from people who are themselves secure, offered gently, without repetition, without an undertone of resentment. The counterfeit version comes reflexively, repeatedly, and almost exclusively in response to your visible progress, never your struggles. Nietzsche was famously suspicious of moral language used as a tool of restraint, what he called, in his sharpest critiques, a form of quiet resentment turned into virtue. When someone repeatedly tells you to stay humble, the moment you gain any momentum, ask yourself honestly, are they protecting your character, or are they protecting their own comfort by keeping you smaller? This dynamic often shows up in families where one sibling begins to outpace the others, financially or professionally, and suddenly, humility becomes the family's favorite topic, aimed only at them. It shows up in friend groups where one person starts taking their health seriously and is met with warnings about not being too obsessed, while everyone else's inactivity goes uncommented on. It shows up in workplaces where an ambitious employee is quietly labeled too intense by colleagues who have long since stopped trying. Carl Jung would call this a projection of the group's unlived potential, a discomfort with someone actualizing what others left dormant, repackaged as concern for their character. The insight to remember: real humility is something you choose for yourself. It is never something that should be weaponized against you by people uncomfortable with your rise. Why do people do this? Why would someone who claims to love you quietly work against your growth? The answer lives in one uncomfortable truth about human nature. Most people do not measure their life in isolation. They measure it against the people closest to them. This is simply how the human mind is wired. It is efficient, it is ancient, and it is almost entirely unconscious. When you grow, you don't just change your own trajectory. You accidentally change the measuring stick for everyone who compares themselves to you. And for people who have made peace with stagnation, that recalibration is deeply threatening, even if they can't consciously name why they feel uneasy around your ambition. Ego plays a central role here. The ego craves stability. It wants a fixed, comfortable story about who is ahead and who is behind, who is trying and who has given up, who is like me and who is not. Your ambition disrupts that story. And when the ego feels destabilized, it doesn't usually respond with reflection. It responds with defense, mockery, dismissal, silence, or subtle sabotage. Insecurity is the second ingredient. People rarely mock what they feel completely secure about. Nobody makes fun of something that doesn't touch a nerve. If your ambition didn't reflect something the mocker secretly wishes they had pursued, it simply wouldn't register as worth commenting on. The mockery is, in a strange way, a confession. Fear is the third layer, often the deepest. Fear of being left behind. Fear of being compared unfavorably. Fear of having to explain to themselves or to others why they stopped trying. It is far less painful to shrink your dream than to sit with the grief of an abandoned one. And finally, unresolved emotional wounds shape all of this quietly in the background. People who were mocked for their own dreams as children often grow into adults who unconsciously repeat that pattern, not out of cruelty, but because it's the only emotional language they were ever taught. Hurt people, left unexamined, tend to redistribute their pain rather than heal it. Marcus Aurelius wrote that people do wrong out of ignorance of what is truly good for them, not out of pure malice. This doesn't mean you must excuse the behavior. It means you can understand it clearly enough to stop taking it personally. And that clarity is where your power begins. Understanding the psychology behind mockery is only half the equation. The other half is knowing exactly how to carry yourself when you encounter it. Stay calm. A reaction gives your ambition away as fragile. Calm signals that your goal doesn't need anyone's permission to exist. Don't over-explain yourself. The instinct to justify your dreams to skeptics is a trap. People who are genuinely rooting for you rarely require a defense. People who mock you were never going to be convinced by one. Set boundaries without announcing them. You don't need a dramatic confrontation. Simply share less. Protect your plans the way you'd protect anything valuable. Quietly, and only with those who've earned access. Protect your energy like it's currency, because it is. Every conversation you have with a discourager costs you something. Spend that energy on your goals instead of on convincing people who never intended to be convinced. Focus on your mission, not your critics. Nietzsche's idea of the will to power was never about dominating others. It was about the relentless, internal drive towards self-overcoming. Let your growth be the only response you offer. Silence, backed by results, is the most disarming reply there is. This dynamic has always existed, but today it moves faster and cuts deeper than ever before. Social media has turned comparison into a constant background hum. It used to take years for someone to notice they'd fallen behind a peer. Now it takes seconds, a single scroll, a single post. This means the discomfort people feel around ambitious friends and family has never been more immediate or more likely to trigger a defensive reaction. The attention economy has also trained people to respond to everything performatively rather than sincerely. A quick, dismissive comment gets the same social reward as genuine support, with far less emotional risk. Mockery has become cheap, fast, and disturbingly casual, often disguised as humor in group chats, comment sections, and offhand remarks. At the same time, comparison culture has quietly rewired how people measure their own worth. Instead of asking, "Am I becoming who I want to be?" many people unconsciously ask, "Am I doing better than the people around me?" This makes your visible growth feel, to certain people, less like inspiration and more like indictment. This is exactly why emotional intelligence matters more now than at any point in recent history. The ability to recognize when someone's reaction to you is about them, not you, is no longer a nice philosophical idea. It's a survival skill for anyone serious about growth in a world engineered to keep people comparing, scrolling, and quietly resenting one another. Understanding this doesn't just protect your ambition, it protects your peace. Here is what you now understand, and what most people will go their entire lives without ever consciously realizing. The people who mock your ambition are rarely commenting on your potential. They are revealing their own relationship with the dreams they buried. Their laughter, their silence, their humbling advice, their sudden distance. None of it is really about the size of your goals. It is about the size of the gap between who they are and who they once hoped to become. This doesn't mean you should hate them. It means you should stop needing their approval. You were never required to shrink yourself to keep others comfortable. You were never obligated to make your dreams smaller so someone else's stagnation would feel less painful by comparison. The moment you understand this, something shifts. Their mockery loses its power, not because you've become cold, but because you've become clear. Marcus Aurelius once wrote that the best revenge is to not be like your enemy. Perhaps the deepest form of that wisdom applied here is this. The best response to someone who mocks your ambition is simply to keep becoming who you were always meant to be. Quietly, relentlessly, without asking for their applause. You are not obligated to explain your fire to people who are content sitting in the dark. Walk forward anyway. Let your results speak in a language mockery could never learn. And remember this, long after this video ends, those who laugh at the climb were never meant to walk beside you at the summit.